Chapter 28. Centra. That's not possible, Cypher mumbled, staring into the darkness that was his room. The old headmaster's personal bedroom here at Galbadia Garden. Now it belonged to Sir Cypher. As everything in this garden belonged to Sir Cypher. It's true. His mistress's voice was in his head now. Like a GF but stronger. She didn't need to be in the room with him anymore to pull on his leash. How could I have forgotten all of that? Cypher asked, whispering in his own disbelief. The headmaster's old bed, now his new bed, was luxurious and large. Cypher was taken care of very well here, and it showed in the health of his skin and quality of his clothing. There was something lost in his eyes though. Something had been sucked out of his soul. And, in its place, was obsession and mania. Cypher was having trouble keeping track of days anymore. Everything seemed to be bleeding into each other. He knew he had spoken to Fujin and Raijin when he had arrived at this garden. He had been debriefed on their failed attempt to take Balam. But he couldn't remember if that was this morning or yesterday morning or last week. He couldn't remember coming into this room to sleep, but his body felt heavy, like he may have been laying there for days. Except his mistress was coming to the garden today, and everything was suddenly clear again. They were going to be abandoning Dalit and discontinue their Elon search elsewhere. They were moving on, regardless of the fact that they weren't finished here yet. His mistress had begun preparing him for what was to come and what he needed to do. Cypher had to work in order to earn the sweet dreams that he had. To earn the glory and respect bestowed upon him by his title. To prepare him today, his mistress had reached her magical hands into his mind and began toying with the memories that lay dormant there. Everything that had been locked away by the GFUs through the years was suddenly brought out into the light. And Cypher couldn't quite believe what it was he was seeing. The memories. He had always known he was an orphan. Tracking down his parents or his heritage had never been of great importance to him though. Cypher felt that, in storytelling, all the best heroes and knights had come from orphan backgrounds. It made the best hero archetype. With his own past being laid bare for his eyes though, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe he shouldn't have looked it all up before. Himself, the chicken wuss, the messenger girl, the great instructor, and, of course, Mr. Leader. All of them, together, as children. Bound together by Elon, their sis. The same Elon that Cypher was currently hunting down to serve up to his mistress's whims. His past. The beginning of his dreams. Looking up to his precious matron who had sheltered him from a harsh world and vowing to protect her. She had laughed, smiling in delight at the enthusiasm of a child who had no real idea what he was saying. Had that been the start of his dream? Matron had never kept the fact that she was a sorceress hidden from the children. She would often use her magic to create fun little games for them. Dancing ice sculptures, winds for their kites, displays of flashy, harmless lights. And more. She had kept monsters away from the orphanage. She had protected them from the war going on around them. If food was scarce, she would create it. If water was low, she would summon more. Cypher, who had lost his family to that war, a child too young to remember, had grown very attached to her. He had loved her powers. Loved her magic. Loved her. When he had learned that they hid from the world because people feared and reviled her, he had been angry. His own origins. His own motivations. Forgotten in the power of the Guardians. But he had succeeded. He had everything he wanted right now. He was a sorceress's knight. He had the respect and might of an entire nation and its army under his control. Childhood dreams be damned, this was his reality now. He was powerful. Unstoppable. He protected his sorceress. He defended her from the world that would turn against her. He had to destroy those who would harm her. That was the vow he had made all those years ago.
Not right now. Now is not the time for dreams. Get up. Obey.
Cypher's eyes, that he didn't realize had closed, opened again. The darkness in the headmaster's old room was suddenly banished. There was sunlight outside now. Had he fallen asleep? He didn't remember having fallen asleep. Time to get to work, he told himself, standing from the bed. If his body protested about movement after so long of stillness, he didn't notice. If a small voice in his head cried out for him to stop what he was doing, to stop all of this, he didn't hear it. Lost in the manic obsession, Cypher picked up his Hyperion and made for the door. He had a destination in mind now. And a purpose to fulfill. That demon Squall. Always protecting Elone. Hogging her. Even now. He knew where she was, of that Cypher had no doubt. He simply had to find him and pull the information out of him. Cypher grinned at the memories of Squall bound to the electric generator. About the way his body had twisted and twitched. The cracking of his bones. The screams of his agony. The screams of Cypher's own agony, buried deep in his heart, as what was still him was ruthlessly covered up by sweet dreams and purpose. Time to put an end to him at last. Somebody. Save me. It took the Shumi tribe 3 days to resupply the garden. The Shumi people, when called upon, were very industrious and creative workers. Though they hadn't budgeted for supplying their large garden, they managed to bring out enough to do so and get to work for future supply runs. What they gave them would last about a week, however the Shumi would have more by then. Eventually, they would only need come back every month or so. More than pleased with the outcome of their journey north, Squall turned his attention to the gathering of magic and supplies for his team. If they were going to go fight a sorceress, he wouldn't allow them to be equipped with anything less than the best. If nothing short of that was good enough for Sid, then he could certainly reach for that same level. In deciding where they should hunt next, it was Sue who suggested Centra. The southern continent had no major cities or communities. At least, not anymore. It was, nowadays, a hub of monster activity, many of which possessed powerful magic spells. Exactly what Squall wanted. Since it would be faster to just travel around the pole of the planet, Nita maneuvered the garden around the island Shumi village sat on and continued around towards the Centra continent. Almost as soon as they landed, people began leaving on day trips. Nita decided to start sleeping during the day and moving at night to allow others to hunt while there was long. Not long after that, they had their first cadet accident. A girl who had gone off on her own hadn't returned at sundown. Which meant that Squall and Sue immediately started an enormous search effort to find her. It took over 3 hours to find her at the bottom of the ravine she had fallen into. Though she was alive, she didn't escape without injuries. Or punishment for leaving on her own. Which prompted Sue to force Squall to deal with the next problem. The rules that needed to be enforced when leaving the garden. On Balam, where almost every monster was easy to defeat, it had never been a problem before. With the garden mobile, it suddenly was. So before Squall could take the others in his team out hunting, he had first needed to draft a new set of rules and regulations for leaving the safety of the garden. It also came with a set of punishments via Sue, who was quite annoyed at the cadet who had gotten hurt. When Nita next pulled the garden to a halt so he could sleep, Squall called a mandatory garden-wide meeting in the cafeteria, the only place big enough to hold everyone. It was there that he gave the address on outing rules.
First and foremost, and more important than any other rule, no seed, cadet, or student is allowed to leave the garden alone,
Squall ordered them from the small dais that elevated him slightly over their heads. His hands were behind his back in parade rest as he spoke calmly and clearly.
Any student caught leaving the garden alone will be subject to harsh punishment, not the least of which is loss of leaving privileges. Secondly, all seeds, cadets, and students are to be back on the garden no later than sundown. If anyone is still outside after sundown, it will be treated as an emergency situation. Search groups will be formed, drive Katawaki will be put on standby, and all resources utilized to find the missing person. I have been informed by Sue that, one way or another, a person who is out after sundown is going to be returning to garden with injuries. Allow that to motivate you. Which brings me to my next point. Every seed, cadet, student, and instructor is required to take their microchips to the technology department to be fitted with a tracking device. This will be considered the first line of defense in finding any who get lost. All other rules regarding outings have already been sent to you. Read them in your own time and memorize the contents. I have already been told by multiple instructors that there might very well be a quiz given over the contents. Thank you for your attention. You may return to your day.
Squall's dismissal was informal. However, the reaction of everyone else was not. Very few remained standing during the small speech. When he finished though, there was no one left sitting as they all got to their feet. An entire room gave him a formal salute before chatter began to break out and people began filing out of the room. Squall let out a long breath, glad that was over with, as Rinoa stood from her place beside the stage and climbed up after him. Her new microchip, installed in a wristband she was wearing under her cotton bracers, already had a tracking device installed. She was, in fact, the first to receive it and had been the test for how far out one could go before they lost signal. It was around 300 yards. Not perfect, but wireless signals never were.
Not bad, Commander,
Rinoa admired, clapping for effect.
I hate public speaking,
Squall growled unhappily.
And don't call me that. You let everyone else call you that,
Rinoa pointed out. He had been unhappy at first, but he had eventually given way when it became apparent that no one was going to stop. It was the first time she had done so, and the first time in a while that she had heard him protest. Squall gave her a dull look as he led them down off the stage. People were excited to get out and test themselves against more Centra monsters. Nita had also told Squall that he had seen some ruins in the distance and that information had somehow gotten out. Squall was already anticipating the headache he would get from wannabe treasure hunters and archaeologists.
Whose magic are we getting today?
Rinoa asked, smiling.
Well, I think we should be able to get the last of it here. If we work our way around Centra, gathering the rest of the mid-level magic shouldn't be a problem. There's even high-level magic here. Not that we can use it. Mid-level will be easy.
Rinoa nodded, agreeing happily. From just traveling across the continent, already she had many new spells from the list Squall had created. Diablos had taken control of them eagerly. He had a great deal of power to control, but he did so easily.
Are we going to go try to look through the ruins?
Rinoa asked eagerly as she kept pace with Squall.
Why? For fun, of course,
Rinoa laughed.
Isn't it crazy that only 80 years ago this place used to be a big civilization? It's amazing how much can change so quickly, hey.
Squall hummed noncommittally. He didn't really care about an old civilization or the cataclysm. None of that was important to him now.
Really makes you wonder about life, doesn't it?
Rinoa sighed, looking up at the ceiling with a soft smile.
How it can all end, poof. Just like that. All those lives that were over before they started. All those people that were killed in their prime. It's really sad. There's haunted lands under our feet, Squall. Doesn't that just give you the woolies?
No, Squall wasn't even sure what the woolies were.
So what are you going to do next? Are we going out hunting now?
Squall looked at his watch, frowning.
We'll have to go out later. Or tomorrow. I need to meet with Sue in about 5 minutes about the seed hiring problem. We think we've got a solution, but we need to hold a test run. Then I have a lesson with the gun blade cadets. Okay.
Squall looked over to her at her chipper answer.
That's it. Is that not enough? Usually you ask to go with me. I thought it bothered you when I did that. I didn't say that,
Squall frowned slightly. He didn't really mind her tagging along with him. He was more worried that she was bothered by how boring his daily life was. Rinoa smiled and stopped as they reached the nexus.
You go talk to Sue. I've got an appointment anyway. With who?
And why did Squall suddenly feel so very concerned about it?
One of the instructors saw me using my blaster edge the other day and offered to give me some specialist training even though I'm not a student. Really?
Wait. She was getting instruction from someone else. Why did he feel so betrayed?
You're a great teacher, Squall,
she hastened to say.
It's just, our weapons are so different. There was naturally going to come a point when you couldn't really teach me anymore. This instructor is a blaster edge master, among other things. Of course.
Squall nodded once, unable to deny that logic. In fact, he started to feel better knowing it was something so perfectly reasonable. It wasn't her attempting to get away from him.
I'll see you after your lesson,
Rinoa promised.
Good luck with Sue.
She waved at him and started walking away. Squall watched her go with hooded eyes. She got only a few steps away before she hesitated mid-step. Squall tilted his head curiously. Rinoa paused for just a second before turning. She smiled and ran at him. Before Squall could react, she was jumping up onto her tiptoes. The soft feeling of her lips against his cheek stole Squall's breath. The contact was brief, not even a full second, before she was falling back down. Rinoa's face was bright red as she took some steps back.
Later.
Squall blinked, frozen in place as she jogged away from him. Squall was rather sure that his face was almost as red as hers had been. Slowly, he reached up and touched his cheek with gentle fingers. He could still feel the heat of her lips burning into his skin, and it felt like every nerve in his body was suddenly focused on that spot. Such a sweet, brief, innocent thing, and it felt like it had just shattered something that Squall didn't realize had long ago hardened in his chest.
Windhill, hey.
Quistis said as she and Squall walked down the hall.
That's actually not a bad idea. It's not exactly a port town, but it's near the water. And it is where Sis is from. That would make a great place to search for her. Shall I tell Nita to set the course? Please,
Squall nodded to her.
Leave the note in his room. He just got off duty. I'm going out hunting. I'm taking Irvine and Zell with me. It's a good place to get their magic. Going to make your way towards the ruins?
Quistis asked, smiling. They were closer today than they were yesterday. Many people were talking about heading that way.
Maybe,
Squall shrugged. He didn't really care. He was going to go where the monsters were. But knowing Irvine and Zell, he would probably find his way down that way.
I plan to be gone through the night. I've already let Sue know. Abusing your power already?
Quistis laughed.
I allowed for special night training sessions in the rules,
Squall told her calmly.
And we can't work Nita every single night. He needs a break as well. You, Irvine, and Zell, Sounds like a fun boys' night. I might get Selfie, Rinoa and Sue together for our own fun night.
Squall hummed in agreement, not really caring. Rinoa already told him she was staying inside tonight, so he wasn't worried about her safety right now.
We'll do typical girl things,
Quistis continued despite his lackluster reaction.
Paint each other's nails. Have sexy pillow fights in our nighties. Compare techniques for pleasuring men with our. Since when did you like lying so much?
Squall asked calmly, raising an eyebrow at her. Quistis laughed at him.
All right, we don't do any of that. But there will be plenty of girl talk. As opposed to.
Quistis continued laughing, shaking her head.
It's just no fun baiting you. I think I'll go find Irvine and taunt him instead. I bet he'll react much better. Don't forget Nita's instructions. Of course,
Quistis nodded and split away from him to walk towards the dorms. Squall continued on towards the front of the garden where Zell and Irvine would probably already be waiting. He wasn't at all surprised to see Rinoa sitting on the rail next to the elevator. He did frown at the sight though because it was a straight drop to the water below.
Isn't that dangerous?
Squall. Rinoa looked up brightly, not having seen him approaching. She quickly jumped down and rushed to his side.
Did you and Quistis finish your lesson? Yeah,
he nodded, stopping in front of her.
I'm going down to meet with Irvine and Zell. Great. I brought your bag.
Rinoa quickly turned and ran back to the rail. She came back again, carrying the black bag he kept in his closet. It was filled with supplies. Squall frowned because he hadn't packed it.
Where did you get that? I found it. Decided to help you by filling it myself.
Rinoa beamed, pleased with herself, as she held out the bag to him.
I asked Sue what you would need and packed it based on that. I can't say that I'm an expert on camping, but I think I learned enough from you to help.
Squall already had everything he would need in his inventory. He could have told her that. Instead, he reached out and took the bag from her hands with a nod.
Thank you.
Rinoa beamed, holding her hands behind her back.
You're leaving now. The sooner we go, the sooner we get back. Yeah, but I get the same amount of time without you either way. Quistis is thinking about organizing a girls' night.
Squall shrugged, wondering if that would be a comfort for her.
That could be fun,
Rinoa nodded.
Though I'll still be lonely without you there. What would I do at a girls' night?
Rinoa burst out laughing at the dead serious tone of his question. Her insinuation went right over his head. She supposed she was going to have to spell things out for him. He just wasn't the kind to let his mind go there without being directed in that direction.
Squall, are you going to think about me while you're gone?
Rinoa asked, stepping in close to him, putting one hand on his chest. Squall's eyes moved from her hand back up to her eyes.
I'm only going to be gone a day. If that. I noticed that wasn't a no,
she grinned. Squall hesitated for a moment before nodding.
Yeah. I'll probably think about you.
Rinoa's grin widened with her eyes.
You admitted it. I said probably.
Honestly, if he was going to base it purely on precedent, he would likely not get her out of his head the entire time they were apart.
That's close enough for me,
Rinoa leaned up just a bit.
I'm going to think about you. So you're going to think about me, and I'm going to think about you. We'll be thinking of each other at the same time. It'll almost be like we're together again. I don't know that logic follows.
Squall raised an eyebrow at her. She laughed at how serious he was all the time.
Our hearts will be together, even if our bodies aren't. Is that a line from your book? No. The line from the book is no matter how far apart we are, even if death should separate us, our hearts will always be together. In that way, my most beloved, we will never truly be alone.
Rinoa reached up with her other hand, grabbing onto his biceps as she stood almost between his legs. The garden around them faded away as the world narrowed. They were going to be apart for only a single night and a day, but that time stretched out before them seemingly infinitely.
How can they be together if one of them is dead?
Squall asked seriously, looking at her with guarded eyes. Like he really wanted her to provide a reasonable answer.
I told you. It's their hearts that are together. Your heart can't be anywhere but in your chest. Our souls then. Our thoughts. Our intentions. We are together in our own hearts, so our hearts are together. Sounds like romantic drivel,
he said softly, his eyes warm on her face.
Yeah. Romantics like to talk that way a lot. But, you know, they're not wrong.
She moved her hands back over his chest, putting them over his beating heart. She could feel the dull, vital thud under her palms and it made her smile.
Can you feel me in your heart, Squall?
All the time. Every day. She was invading, his every thought and emotion.
I noticed that wasn't a no,
she smiled as his silence, coming in closer. Her scent was wrapping around him now, blurring the world in his mind. He could count every eyelash on her slowly closing lids, denying him the sight of her beautiful brown eyes but drawing his attention down to her plump pink lips. Coming together, reaching for him. He wasn't trying to stop her. His own head was angling, his nerves straining for her. He needed a taste of those sweet lips to last him in their hours apart. If he must be separated from her scent, from her sweet touch, then he could go with the memory of the taste of her lips. Her back arched, her chest against his. His free hand itched to reach out and touch her. He started reaching out to grab her waist and pull her in closer. To completely eradicate any space that might exist between their bodies. Their breath mingled together in the air between them. Squall's eyes started to shut, to allow him to better feel. He could feel the heat of her torso just under his palm.
Yo, Squall.
Rinoa jumped backwards as Squall threw a dark look over his shoulder. Zell was waving at the two of them as he walked in closer. He was smiling without a care.
Glad I'm not making you wait,
he said, drawing even with them.
I thought for sure you would already be down there. I got caught up showing. I mean. I just got caught up. Subtle,
Rinoa frowned, crossing her arms.
You were with the library girl, weren't you? She wanted me to show her how I make my gloves,
Zell explained, smiling.
She likes sewing, you know. It's something we have in common. I still can't believe you like sewing.
Rinoa's eyebrow went up.
Of course. I've wanted to start making my own gloves for a while.
Zell raised his current pair.
And do you know how often I have to fix these things? Better to just learn it myself.
Rinoa sighed, giving Squall a side glance. He was carefully not looking at her. She could tell, however, by the hard set of his jaw just how annoyed he was with Zell.
Shall we get going?
Zell asked, oblivious.
Yeah,
Squall said flatly for want of anything better. Humming, ignorant of what he had interrupted, Zell started strutting off towards the front. Rinoa sighed and looked over to Squall with a sad smile for what was lost.
Have fun.
Rinoa touched his arm and leaned up.
And keep me in your heart.
Squall said nothing as she stood up to give him a kiss on his cheek. A second one, as sweet as the first, tinged now with bitterness. It wasn't as quick as the first one and he had more time to appreciate her soft lips. Now he could imagine easier what it would be like to have her lips against his. And he wanted it more than anything before in his life. Rinoa smiled as though she could see it in his face.
The sooner you go, the sooner you get back, right?
Squall didn't say anything for a moment. Which was fine with her. Rinoa had learned to appreciate his silence. He just wasn't a talkative kind of guy. She started to turn to leave, to let him go off on his own. When he called after her.
How about when I get back? We have dinner.
She turned again, a bit confused.
Sure. Want me to reserve some hot dogs or something? No, I mean dinner.
Rinoa blinked. Not understanding.
Maybe. Dress up. Have something a little special. A date.
Rinoa gasped softly. Her heart began racing as she looked at Squall's face. Turned away from her just a bit in embarrassment. She almost tripped over herself in her eagerness to accept. He smiled at her. A very subtle upturn of his lips. But it was powerful. And it made her feel like everything in the world was made better by the sight. He nodded once, then turned and started after Zell. It was hardly a declaration of love. And it was brief. Squall moved away rather quickly, putting a bit more haste into his steps from embarrassment. From anyone else, Rinoa would almost have considered that a rude farewell. Because it was Squall, no one else but Squall, she felt her heart melting in her chest. He had smiled at her. Not with her or about her, but deliberately at her. He had shown a sign of happiness and he had shared that moment with her. And he had explicitly asked for a third date. His idea. With no prompting on her part. He would finally be hers. All hers. No other girl could tempt him away. Not that she expected him to be interested, she was just putting her claim on him. The thought of any other woman throwing him eyes made her angry. Rinoa didn't realize that she was the jealous type until she had spotted some other garden girls looking at him as he passed by. Not at all acceptable. It turned out that Rinoa was absolutely the envious, possessive girl. Squall was a fantastic specimen of manhood and strength. Loyal, responsible, strong, smart, and incredibly attractive, even despite the long scar across his face. A guy like that could no doubt make a great, safe house anywhere he chose. He had a great source of income, mastery over one of the most powerful weapons in the world, and was a physically perfect human. No doubt he appealed to all the seed girls around here. There was no way Rinoa was just going to stand back and watch as one of them tried to move in on her territory. Oh, crap. Rinoa had worn her only nice dress in front of him twice. And she had absolutely nothing sexy to wear under it. Even if she could get him to lay his claim, there was no way she was ready for him to do so.
Quistis. Selfie.
Rinoa turned and ran off in desperation. Ever since the Great Cataclysm, the once fertile and vibrant lands of Centra had become little more than a wasteland. What forests did grow were made of the toughest, sturdiest plants. Monsters ran rampant here, where their numbers were usually tamed around the other continents. With no cities, with no human civilizations, the monsters were free to roam and breed without end. Squall barely had time to do anything but fight monsters since he left the garden. His group wasn't the only one to leave the safety of their mobile base, but there was still a surplus of monsters in all directions.
Damn!
Zell panted as he stood up from the remains of the grand mantis they had just recently brought down. He wiped his gauntlet over his sweating brow.
They just keep coming. You aren't lying,
Irvine nodded, grateful he had left his coat behind. It was hot enough down here that he didn't at all need it. He rather found himself envying the power that Shiva had that enabled Squall to be perfectly fine even in hot weather. The good thing about the constant barrage of monsters was that they were finding themselves quickly gathering a great deal of magic and supplies. And being so busy gave Squall little time to focus on the hollow feeling left in his chest at being away from Rinoa. What was wrong with him? How obsessed could one person be? He had lived his life just fine before her for nearly 20 years. Surely after only a few months he wasn't so attached that he couldn't go a single afternoon without her.
So are we heading towards the ruins?
Irvine asked, pointing over to where the structure sat in the middle of nothing. Many had already gone. And though all of them came back, they all insisted that they didn't want to return. Squall looked over his shoulder, back to where the garden was floating over the land. They had traveled a decent way from the building. However, Squall thought they could probably still make it back before curfew if they moved quickly. He could see her again. There would be no purpose. He turned back deliberately. He was going to stay away to prove a point. He wasn't entirely sure what point, but he was proving it.
Yeah, let's go to the ruins,
he said, walking forward. The physical exertion was probably going to be good for him anyway.
I've got snacks,
Selfie declared, walking into Shu's room with her arms loaded down with all of the secret stash of Zell's room.
You can put them there,
Sue pointed to the counter in her kitchenette. Shu's room had been chosen for this particular get-together because her room was on the 3rd floor and was bigger than the standard seed dorm.
This place is really nice,
Rinoa said, turning around. It was close to the small suites enjoyed by the regular students in that she had a door between her bedroom and the rest of the apartment. She also had her own bathroom and a small TV in the wall. It was hardly a palace, but it was the biggest room Rinoa had seen around the garden yet.
All upper-level personnel live on the 3rd floor,
Sue explained, setting out the mixed drinks she had prepared herself.
Myself, Sid, and a few of the senior-level instructors have their rooms on this floor. It's much more private than the dorms. What about Squall? Squall,
Rinoa pressed.
He's the commander. Is that not high enough level? Yeah, most definitely,
Sue nodded.
There's no room at the moment though. All the suites are full. I already talked to Squall about it. He said it was okay. He didn't mind living in the dorms despite his title. Does that bother you? Well, the dorm room walls aren't soundproof,
Selfie said, picking through the trail mix she had just poured into a bowl to pick out the chocolate pieces.
Selfie.
Rinoa flushed bright red.
What? Am I wrong?
Selfie looked up innocently.
Why else would you ask me about lingerie? She asked you about lingerie.
Quistis looked up, startled.
I regret everything.
Rinoa hid her face in her hands.
Well, this just got more interesting,
Sue grinned.
Don't tell me you're actually considering making love to him, Rinoa? Can you imagine what that would be like? Missionary,
Selfie said immediately.
Regimented,
Sue grinned.
He'd be totally quiet,
Quistis nodded knowledgeably.
That was always the thing I dreaded most about him. I can't imagine trying to be in bed with a ghost. Okay, I bet he would not even.
Rinoa lifted her head defiantly, crossing her arms.
He would definitely be passionate and intense and creative. And what makes you so sure of that?
Selfie asked, grinning at her over the trail mix bowl.
Nothing like a fire to keep the monsters away,
Irvine grinned, leaning back away from the flickering flames. The flickering flames were illuminating very little of the wasteland before them. The large ruins that rested about half an hour's walk away were a hulking shadow in the sky. Squall hummed noncommittally as he ran a cleaning rag down his gun blade. There were so many monsters here, he had needed to keep fighting with very little breaks to wipe blood and guts from his blade. They were only staying away now due to a combination of the campfire and the barrier of ice and earth Squall and Irvine had created.
This has been a great day,
Zell smiled, gently threading a needle with some tough black thread.
Hey, what's that you're doing there?
Irvine asked, pointing at him with his Bismarck's gun barrel.
Needlepoint,
Zell held up the small pillow he had stored in his pocket all day.
Very relaxing.
Irvine blinked at him.
Needlepoint? I can feel your judgment and I don't care,
Zell said calmly, beginning to gently work on the bird that would eventually form on that pillow.
Moving on to something immediately more manly,
Irvine turned from him quickly.
Squall? Please stop cleaning and say something manly. Zell, your stitches are a bit big. Oh, you think?
Zell turned his pillow around curiously.
I hate you both,
Irvine grumbled, setting his gun between his legs.
Well, what would you prefer to talk about?
Zell snickered at him.
Guns and women are both appropriate, manly topics,
Irvine grinned.
I'm honestly down for either. Preference on guns. Unless we're talking about naked women. In which case? Guns it is,
Squall cut him off smoothly.
Methinks Squall is keeping some dirty exploits to himself,
Irvine grinned.
About a certain raven-haired lovely, I would assume. I bet she's bomb naked. Those full breasts and hips make a great and shutting up now. Good choice,
Squall said coldly, lowering the gun blade he had leveled at Irvine's throat.
I'd love to help, Rinoa,
Quistis shrugged helplessly.
but your hips and breasts are bigger than mine. My underwear just wouldn't fit you.
Quistis gestured down to her long, lean, willowy body. Her breasts and hips were both less dramatic than Rinoa's. Anything she tried to loan her would be too tight.
Don't look at me,
Selfie raised her hands in helplessness. Selfie's hips were longer, her breasts smaller. Shu's hips and breasts were both bigger. None of them would be able to let Rinoa borrow something sexy.
What's wrong with your underwear?
Sue asked, sitting down next to Quistis on her small love couch.
There's nothing really wrong with it,
Rinoa sighed, leaning against the table on the bar stool.
It's just not all that pretty. You know? I don't want to show Squall boring underwear. Honestly, I can't imagine he'd care. He's a seed. He appreciates function over form. Sue, would you go to bed with someone wearing plain undies? Oh, hi no. Not the first time. Are you crazy?
Sue laughed.
I would wear boy shorts,
Selfie laughed.
I like boy shorts. They're comfy. Well, we don't exactly have a lingerie store in the garden,
Quistis shrugged.
I suppose we could stop by a town and buy you something the next chance we get. When are you planning this? Well, it's not so much a plan,
Rinoa shrugged.
I'm just trying to prepare for anything. I don't want to have a moment start then realize I'm wearing bad undies. He won't care,
Sue promised.
I'll care. Not everything is about him.
Rinoa sighed again, poking through the trail mix.
I'll feel so unsexy. It will totally ruin the moment. You could always wear no undies,
Selfie suggested brightly.
Commando is the way to go. Please don't sit on any more of my furniture,
Sue frowned at her.
Seriously? You find that attractive?
Zell asked, making a face at Irvine.
What can I say? It's the crazy ones that are the best in bed.
Irvine grinned.
Selfie is the next level combo of hot, crazy, and sweet. She'd bang me like a drum, make me cookies, then feed them to me while brushing my hair. That level of insane is unbelievably good in bed. Irvine. Yes. I told you 3 times already, I do not want to have this conversation with you,
Squall said firmly, glaring at him pointedly as he clicked his blade back into its sheath. Zell chuckled.
All right then. Let's talk about Zell's girl.
Irvine grinned.
Wait. My what?
Zell looked up quickly.
I don't have a girl. You're doing needlepoint to impress her.
Irvine pointed at the pillow.
Also, that bird is coming along really well. Oh, thanks. Wait. I'm not trying to impress her. We're just working on it together. Separately. You know what I mean. Hey, I'm not judging,
Irvine grinned, holding up his hands.
I've done more embarrassing things for less sweet girls. That library girl has got that whole girl next door thing going on. I really appreciate that look. The ponytail, the big lips. It works. Stop talking about her like that,
Zell frowned, lowering his pillow.
And why does everyone insist on calling her the library girl? She has a name. Yeah, but you never let us meet her, so how can we know it? She works in a public place. You can meet her at any time. Yeah, but we want to meet her,
Irvine grinned salaciously.
You know what we mean. Squall, help me out here,
Zell beseeched him.
Irvine, you've got second watch. You should go to sleep.
Squall obliged, leaning back on his hands to keep lookout as he was on first watch.
Actually, now that your gun blade is safely away. Watch it. Let's talk about Rinoa. Irvine.
Zell frowned.
If he kills you out here, I'm not ratting him out. So are you trying to hit that? Irvine, stop talking,
Squall warned him softly.
I'm not asking for dirty details. Well, actually, I am. After all this time, you've had to have done something with her. That girl is throwing herself at you. If you're not catching that tail, then I'm going to have to question your preferences. Your disrespect for her astounds me,
Squall growled warningly as Zell pointedly became suddenly fascinated with making his stitches near invisible.
Not disrespect.
Irvine looked confused and surprised at the accusation.
This is what friends do, Squall. They give each other intimate details on each other's lives. Do you think that Rinoa isn't doing the same thing with the girls? I can trust the girls to keep their mouths shut. I can't give you that same confidence. That hurts, man.
Irvine grabbed for his chest dramatically, like there was a pain in his chest.
I thought we were close.
Squall raised an eyebrow at him. There was absolutely no desire in him to reveal anything whatsoever to these two. The only one he was prepared to divulge secrets about any part of his life to was Rinoa herself.
Come on. I've told you about Selfit. Despite my protests. And Zell told you about the library chick. Despite his protests. So now you have to speak. Fair is fair. I never agreed to this deal. It's only in your own head. Also, no, I don't. It usually gets colder around him when he's thinking something naughty,
Rinoa explained, taking a bite of a piece of fruit from Shumi village. The sweet juices coated her tongue and she licked at the corner of her mouth to catch them all.
He thinks I don't notice, but I'll catch him staring at my chest. That's usually right when it gets colder. So Squall is a boob man,
Sue said thoughtfully.
I guess that makes sense,
Quistis shrugged.
He never really had a mother to care for him. It stands to reason that he would become more obsessed with breasts. Irvine is more of an ass man,
Selfie interjected, laying upside down on Shu's small sofa. Quistis was next to her. Sue and Rinoa were sharing the floor.
He likes staring at me when I bend down. That explains why you've been so clumsy and dropping everything lately,
Sue raised an eyebrow at her.
I was wondering if I was going to have to put you through a physical early just to make sure you weren't losing your abilities. Nope. Just letting him stare.
Selfie giggled.
I keep waiting for him to go for it, but it's like he's waiting for the right time. Which is so cute. I wonder if he knows I'm a sure thing. Like Hein you are,
Sue told her firmly.
You may be a seed, and we may be a floating base now, but sexual activity is still banned within the garden. Hey.
Selfie pointed at Rinoa.
Then how come you're talking about it with her?
Psh, Sue chuckled.
Like Squall would ever willingly break a rule. He's not going to touch her so long as he's in garden. Oh, yeah? Then what about you two?
Selfie turned her accusatory finger on Quistis and Sue.
You think I haven't noticed that you two have been going at it like crazy? They've been what?
Rinoa shot up, her eyes wide in shock.
Have you ever kissed anyone, Squall?
Irvine pressed, looking at him with a smirk.
I mean, no judging, right? I'm just curious.
Like all the preceding questions, Squall ignored it without so much of a twitch of an eyelid. That fell into the category of none of his business, and Squall had no intentions on revealing information that Irvine had no right to knowing.
Just give up already,
Zell grumbled, glaring at him from where he was laying on the ground.
One of us is trying to actually get some sleep around here. I kissed my first girl when I was 13,
Irvine said, thinking back with a smile.
I may have forgotten some in between, but I never forget her. She was pretty cute, especially at the time. I gave her my ice cream in exchange. So you had a prostitute for your first kiss?
Zell grinned, earning a glare.
I think you just insulted her more than me. What are you talking about? She was smart. She traded a kiss that I promise wasn't her first for your ice cream. She totally won out on that deal. You're the dummy that lost your ice cream. Oh yeah? What was your first kiss then?
Irvine glared. Zell grinned.
I'll never tell. You've never been kissed either, hey?
Irvine smirked at him.
That's so cute. Would you two like me to get you some ice cream? It was an accident.
Quistis flushed bright red.
Yeah,
Selfie nodded sagely.
I can't tell you how many times I repeatedly, accidentally smash my genitals against someone else's. I want details.
Rinoa leaned forward eagerly.
When? How? Why? We were drunk.
Quistis yelled. Rinoa and Selfie squealed loudly. Quistis groaned, lowering her head into her hands.
It was a little while back,
Sue explained.
We were drinking and, well, one thing led to another. It was a pretty great night. Even if we were both out of it. What?
Rinoa shook her head with a wide grin.
I thought you had a thing for Squall. Well, I did. That's why we got drunk in the first place. It was right after you got here, Rinoa. I was kind of depressed. We were just comforting each other. Okay, that explains the first one,
Selfie grinned, leaning forward.
What about the others? Well, I was going to do it only the once,
Quistis bit her lips.
But after I realized that what I was feeling was sisterly love, well, I thought we'd try for another one. I had no idea you were lesbian.
Rinoa leaned her head on her hand, grinning.
Well, I've always been bi,
Quistis shrugged.
I've just also always had a thing for Squall. Or I thought I did anyway. Sue and I. Well, it's comfortable. I don't know where it's going, but I'm enjoying myself right now. Well, that's most important,
Selfie grinned.
But, better question, does Irvine know yet? No. Why? Oh, please, let me tell him,
Selfie snickered delightedly.
I want to see his face. Irvine's going to be staring at you for a while,
Rinoa laughed.
What about you two?
Quistis asked.
You two ever slept with anyone? Yeah,
Selfie grinned.
A cute guy back at Trabia. We were together for about 3 months. Then what happened?
Rinoa asked curiously.
Don't really know. He told me that he couldn't take it anymore. He was in tears. I think that maybe he fell out of love with me or something.
The others stared at her. She looked back.
What? Nothing,
Rinoa said quickly.
I feel kind of bad for him.
Sue shook her head.
Yeah,
Quistis nodded.
What?
Selfie looked between them, her eyes wide and innocent.
What about you, Rinoa?
Sue asked, deliberately not answering the question.
No, I haven't slept with anyone,
she shrugged, leaning back against the couch.
Not even Cypher?
Quistis pressed. Rinoa shook her head.
No. Cypher was always a little self-obsessed. He was so busy showing off that he didn't really care about me. I was his adoring audience. Did you kiss him?
Sue asked, sipping at her drink.
I tried to once. He kind of ruined the moment. Made such a show of trying to kiss me back that we didn't actually get to the act itself. Well, have you ever kissed anyone at all?
Selfie asked.
Yeah. A boy at my academy. We were pretty close until I found out that he was only with me because he wanted to get close to my dad. I pushed him off of the greenhouse roof. He had a broken ankle and I was grounded for 3 months. But it was worth it.
That moment had been the one that had started her life of rebellion and dissent. Honestly, she owed that boy a thanks for breaking her from the spell of obedience and mindlessness. That heartbreak had really opened her eyes. Rinoa smiled.
Honestly, Squall reminds me a bit of my father. But different, you know? He's all the best parts of my father without any of the negatives. He gets this look his eyes. Like he's on. All the time. He's so intense. I bet kissing him would be unbelievable. See, I always thought the opposite,
Sue hummed.
He seems so boring and regimented that I can't imagine him being a good lover. No way,
Rinoa moaned softly.
He's so dedicated to doing things right. I bet he would keep going until I was breathless and unable to scream any longer. Those rough hands and those big arms. I bet he'd be great with those hands. And that mouth. You need a moment alone?
Sue asked, grinning at her.
I need a moment with him,
Rinoa smirked.
Ow. Disrespectful. Overly sensitive.
Zell and Irvine continued to grunt and groan as they grappled across the campfire. Squall watched them with an even gaze. They had been going at it for a few minutes now. They weren't trying to land any blows to kill, and Zell was holding way back, but they were definitely hitting hard enough to leave marks. Squall ignored them and lifted his eyes up towards the moon. He could hear some nocturnal monsters moving out on the plains, but they were held at bay by their magic barriers. What was Rinoa doing? Was she thinking about him? Were their hearts together like she said? Selfie and Quistis were discussing certain techniques as Rinoa sat in Shu's windowsill. From here, she had a near-perfect view of the moon. Would Squall be able to see it where he was on the open plains? He would probably be on first watch. He always took first watch. So he was no doubt still up. Are you thinking about me, Squall? Can you feel my heart? Rinoa smiled as she leaned against the glass of the window. A third date tomorrow. She was going to start officially calling herself his girlfriend. And, if he didn't say anything, she would assume that to be his agreement. It would no doubt take him a while to admit it himself, but she could wait. Squall was worth waiting for. The next morning found Squall, Irvine, and Zell having sought out the Centran ruins. Despite the lack of desire to be there, Squall wasn't at all surprised that he was there.
"What a weird building,"
Irvine said, tilting his head at the strange structure that was all that was left of the Centran civilization. Most of it had been destroyed in the cataclysm. However, there was still something left inside of a giant, diamond-shaped structure balanced on its tip. A decrepit, tall building in the center had very old, deteriorating architecture.
"Let's get closer,"
Zell grinned, urging them towards the staircase entrance.
"I'm looking forward to these monsters,"
Irvine grinned. Squall let them talk as he adjusted his gun blade on his hip. He was keeping the sheath out today to make for easier drawing. He had upgraded his weapon while he was in Balam. The twin blades that made up his new punishment was deadly and far lighter than his previous gun blades. He had been getting a great workout using it today. They walked forward towards the entrance. A small, crumbling stone archway opened up onto a flight of stairs that led up into the structure. There was a sign next to the archway. Faded and chipped. Irvine frowned at it, squinting to try to read the old writing.
"My blue heaven. What's that mean?"
Squall shrugged.
"Might be the name of the building. Do you want to keep?" "I am Odin."
Squall's hand was on the hilt of his blade. Zell dropped into a fighting stance, and Irvine cried out even as he lifted up his gun and aimed out. The three of them automatically turned to put their backs together, but they saw nothing. A long moment strung out as they looked around, waiting. There was no further sound. They saw only a breeze sweeping around the dust amongst the leaves.
"What was that?"
Irvine finally asked as the silence strained on. The voice had been deep, powerful. It had sounded so close. Like the owner had been speaking right into their ears.
"Okay,"
Zell said slowly, rising carefully.
"That was creepy."
"Squall." He didn't respond immediately. As he stood up straight, he kept his hand on his sword.
"I don't know. Let's keep going."
Squall." Irvine hit his arm, catching his attention. Squall turned quickly, thinking maybe Irvine had found the source of the voice. From the edge of the trees, not far from the arch, a tiny green monster came around from behind a tree trunk. It moved slowly, seemed to be wearing a burlap sack, and held a lantern in one hand and a knife in the other. It was walking, kind of awkwardly, from the trees.
"What is it?"
Irvine frowned.
"Looks like a tonberry."
Zell tilted his head at it.
"Yeah,"
Squall nodded once.
"They hostile?"
Irvine asked.
"They are, though it's hard to tell immediately from looking. They move so slow that it's hard to think they can do much damage. That knife of theirs is deadly though." "Is he coming at us?"
Irvine asked, tilting his head. The tonberry was walking closer to them. It moved so slow though that it would probably take literal minutes for it to reach them.
"Kill it,"
Squall ordered.
"Ah, seriously?"
Irvine frowned.
But it's so harmless. It almost looks cute. If you don't kill it, it'll kill you.
Squall crossed his arms.
I'd rather not start fighting Tonberries. They're tribal monsters. They work in teams. If one starts coming, you can bet money that others are going to show up. So? What are they going to do? Meander us to death? Irvine, take a look around. Do you see any exits to this place besides this staircase? No. So if we go up there, we have to return in this spot. By then, that Tonberry will be right here waiting for us. As will his entire family. They're slow and tiny, but they're tough. Bullets can't pierce that skin. They can go days without water and weeks without food. If those things lay siege on us, it will only be a waiting game for them. Which is what they want. Shoot it. Yeah.
Irvine lifted his shotgun and took aim.
Sorry little guy. Demo ammo will make it fast and painless.
The Tonberry, waddling slightly as it moved in closer, was watching its large feet. Like it might have to do so in order to not trip over its own limbs. Irvine shook his head. But he had his orders, and if there was anything his new seed training was teaching him, it was that you always followed orders. The demo ammo was loud as it burst from the barrel of the gun. Irvine's aim was true, as it always was, and the Tonberry fell onto its back.
Good night, sweet prince,
Irvine sighed.
Hey, can we go steal that knife?
Zell asked. A soft squeaky noise caught his attention. Irvine's mouth fell as the Tonberry gently pushed itself back to its feet. Its burlap sack was worse for the wear, but the Tonberry was not. It dusted off its chest before looking up at them and continuing its slow march.
Okay, so that's creepy,
Irvine frowned.
You stay here and keep the Tonberries back,
Squall ordered as Irvine let off another shot.
Zell and I will keep moving forward to see what we can find. Damn, monster,
Irvine growled, shooting a third round. Squall set foot in the staircase and immediately the rails started glowing blue. He eyed them suspiciously as he started moving up. The color followed him, but nothing attempted to stop him from going upwards.
Maybe it was a dance club,
Zell laughed at the trailing color of the railing. It faded into a bright green as it tracked their movement. At the top, they were greeted by a dry fountain with a series of statues in the center. Most prominently, a woman with long hair lounging back on her hand.
To him who doth vanquish me, I grant my august powers. There it is again,
Zell frowned, looking at the sky.
Squall, what is that? I don't know,
he admitted, frowning. Squall and Zell circled around the fountain, hopping over a break in the platform that looked down into ancient machinery and dry pipes. At the back, another light-up staircase led them upwards further to a large archway that peaked to the building proper. They continued inside and were greeted by small twin staircases that led up to a platform. The room wasn't dark despite not possessing any windows or visible lights.
Awesome,
Zell grinned, looking around.
I'm really digging this old-school architecture. I'm thinking of building a house in this style. Focus, Zell. There are still monsters inside here.
Squall started up the small staircases towards the platform. He thought it was a small landing right before the ledge up above them. Zell stood below, hands on his hips, looking around. Squall stepped onto the platform and he heard machinery begin to whir. Squall! Zell turned quickly, running up the stairs after him. The platform jerked suddenly up, sending Squall to his knees. After that jump though, it began to rise much slower. Still too fast for Squall to jump down to safety. By the time he got back up, the platform was already slipping into its shaft and raising him up. "Squall!" he heard Zell yelling after him. Squall looked away from the platform and back to the top of the shaft.
"You are the strongest. Tell me your name."
Squall turned quickly. That voice again. So strong that he could swear it was directly behind him. He looked around the stone elevator, probably magic operated, and saw no sort of speaker that might transmit the voice.
"I am Squall. Squall Leonhardt,"
he answered, casting his eyes about. He waited, but he heard nothing else. He turned again, but the voice remained silent. The stone platform breached the top of the shaft and stopped. Squall stood there for a moment, looking at his new surroundings. He was about halfway up the building inside the diamond structure. There were no rails, only empty space between him and a long fall to the ground. From up here, he could distantly hear the gunshots Irvine was still letting out. He turned around and found himself face to face with the center of the structure. Two ladders, built into the stone. Between them, something that looked like a mixture between an altar and a control panel. It was dark at the moment. Squall stepped off of the platform and looked around. He waited for something to happen, but nothing did. Experimentally, he stepped back onto the platform. It did not start to go down, to his dismay. So he stepped off again and looked between the ladders.
"Odin, hey!"
he mumbled to himself, tilting his head back to look up to the tops of the ladders. The one on the right led halfway up the tower, then stopped on a platform. The one on the left continued on just a little higher and led to a dark entryway into the tower. Resigning himself to the climb, Squall pushed his sheath back out of the way and started towards the ladder. At least the stone ladder was built into the building. He didn't have to worry about rungs breaking or the entire ladder falling over. He lost count of how many of the steps he had gone up. He started just focusing on the one directly above him. The ladder was that tall. Until he suddenly hit the small landing. He climbed up and faced another ladder, this one much smaller, that led up to an archway. Eager to see what was at the end, he climbed up quickly and walked inside. The tiny room he walked into smelled like rust, oil, and metal. Strange orange orbs and black metal cages hung from above the ceiling. A single control panel with a black orb set into it had pride of place at the end of a very short walkway. It looked almost like the sort of machinery that he had seen in the sub-levels of the garden. He walked over to the control panel and looked at it. He had already gone this far. He reached out and pushed the orb. It rolled easily under his hands. He didn't know if it was his touch or the fact that he rolled it that brought it to life. Either way, the orb started glowing blue and the cages above his head started slowly turning. As they did, Squall heard the unmistakable, distinct hum that was electricity running through the walls and wires. The tower had come back to life and had done so without complaint. Back at the bottom of the ladders, the altar/console now had a blue glowing screen. Squall moved over to it, hoping that it would activate the elevator and let him go back down. He touched the screen and it asked him if he would like to operate the system. He clicked yes and looked back to the elevator. It wasn't the platform that began moving though. To the right of the tower, a series of steps burst out of the wall and began winding up and around the tower. Further from where he wanted to go. Grumbling, almost wishing it was a ladder again, Squall started up the stairs. Halfway up the tower, he passed the smaller ladder leading to the control room. The final landing ended in a column. On the other side of it, there was a locked door and a small ladder leading up to a ledge that held a stone statue of what looked like a bearded man, with a single, gleaming ruby eye. Squall looked around the area, noting the next staircase, the ladder, and the door.
Warrior. Odin.
Nothing else. Squall looked over to the statue where the gleaming ruby eye awaited. Curious, he moved over and climbed up the short ladder. He jumped across to the ledge and stepped in front of the statue. A small plaque at its feet declared its name.
Odin All-Father,
Squall read off. His eyes traveled up to the gleaming ruby in the left eye, then frowned when it was the right eye that sparkled. He leaned in closer and reached up to touch the empty socket. His gloved fingers found electronic circuitry, not dissimilar to an electronic chip reader. On a hunch, Squall reached over and touched the ruby. He pressed it down and, when he pulled back again, it popped into his hands. He pulled it out and looked into the socket. More gleaming electronics waited. He looked back at the ruby, but it wouldn't fit into the right spot. It was shaped to only fit into the left eye.
What do I do with this?
He asked no one. He looked back down, wondering what to do now. Odin didn't answer him and Squall went back down the ladder, staring at the ruby in his hands. He tried the door under the statue next but it was locked. That left only the staircase. Shrugging, resigning himself to whatever, he climbed the stairs. Did this place never cease going up? At the top of the stairs, he found himself facing another ladder, this time curving up the side of a domed rood. Squall let his eyes follow the path and found himself looking up at another statue of Odin at the top. Whatever. Squall put the ruby in his pocket and started up the ladder. The Odin statue here was differently shaped but it also had a single eye ruby. The left eye. Squall pulled the right from his pocket and slipped it in place. The electronics clicked in recognition. From the mouth of the statue, a series of numbers were whispered out. So soft that he might not have heard it at all if he weren't listening for the clicks of the electronics. Okay. Now what? Squall waited for a moment to see if anything else would happen. He looked around, truly now at the top of the tower. He couldn't hear Irvine's gunshots from up here any longer. The wind was colder than it had been at the base. And he could see the garden from here. Tiny speck in the distance thought it was. Rinoa was there. He had to hurry and get off this damn tower. He wanted to return to garden already and get back to her side. He was so done with this hunting trip. Almost angry now, he hurriedly popped the two rubies out of their sockets. Nothing happened. He stuck them into his pocket and started working his way back down. Back in front of the door, he looked up at the first Odin statue. The empty eye sockets flashed at him from the angle the sun was hitting them. Squall climbed back up and moved over to the statue. Hoping he wasn't just walking around in circles, he popped the eyes back into place. As the second one slid in, Squall heard more clicking. The small explosion of fire had him turning in time to see a bright orange and yellow flame bursting into life on top of the column. It wasn't exactly a way down, but it was better than nothing.
You seek entrance? No.
Squall crossed his arms.
Actually, I seek an exit.
Nothing. Squall grumbled. He cast his mind about. Then, unable to think of anything else, he started listing off the numbers he had been given at the top. The sliding of a metal door told him that the entrance below him had finally been opened. Instead of going towards the ladder, Squall dropped down and just vaulted to the platform below. He stood and eyed the dark entrance warily. He just wanted to get back already. He walked inside. His gunblade clinked at his side against his belts. The gleaming metal armor of the enormous man inside was blinding even in the low light. Seated upon a large metal throne was a man with high thorns on his head.
Excellent,
Odin's familiar voice came from directly in front of him now.
Prepare thyself. For what?
Squall asked, annoyed.
The weak shall perish. The strong shall triumph. As it's always been. Prevail over my sword and I shall grant it to thee. Are you a GF?
Squall asked, reaching back to grab the hilt of his saber.
GF? What is this? A guardian force. Someone who lives in your head and fights for you. I told you already, mortal. I am Odin. I will not bow to you. I will not be your eidolon. You and I shall be comrades. If you can prove yourself worthy of my power.
Squall considered him for a moment. He wasn't afraid, despite the fact that Odin was easily 2.5 times his size. He measured Odin not as an opponent but as a potential ally. GF or not, if he was offering Squall his power, then Squall wanted to see what he was offering. Instead of being insulted, Odin grinned under his dissecting gaze.
Odds are a bit heavy on your side,
Squall finally said, pulling out his blade.
Worry not,
Odin assured him, lifting his own, wide, sharp blade.
I'll only attack you if you cannot defeat me in a timely manner. To keep the fight fair. Not a concept I'm used to.
Squall lifted his punishment and aimed it at Odin's chest.
Let's make this quick. I really want to get home. For the honor then,
Odin grinned at him, standing to his feet.
Let us fight.
Squall charged and swung up his blade in upward angled strike. Odin caught the blow easily. Then he took the time to look over Squall's sword. Checking the quality of the metal, the care of the blade, the cleanliness of the gun. Odin threw him back when he was done. Squall rolled with it smoothly. Odin hadn't been trying to harm him. He grinned at Squall, as though pleased with the strength of his strike. He held up his sword, growling to the sky.
Sleipnir. To me.
The impossibly loud whinny of a horse rumbled through the air. From seemingly nowhere, through the metal walls, a large grey horse, perfectly sized for Odin, charged into the room. Steam hissed from his nostrils. The gleaming metal and leather of his saddle shined in the low light. Its 6 legs worked in tandem together easily as it came to a halt before Odin. Squall leaned his blade against his shoulder as Odin mounted the horse. His blade gleamed brightly as he straddled the beast in one easy movement. Squall had to stare for a moment. He had only seen horses in pictures from long ago. They had all been wild animals though. He couldn't imagine someone trying to ride a horse like a chocobo. Seeing Odin doing so was very odd to him. Also, he didn't consider himself an expert in extinct animals, but he was rather sure that every picture he had seen of horses had been with 4 legs.
You know, chocobos make far superior mounts.
Odin grinned at him.
Not all worlds have your birds, warrior. Hey!
Squall frowned at him, confused. Odin merely grinned. He shrugged. Whatever. If Odin wanted to ride a wild animal, that was his choice. He lifted his blade and his eyes started going over the massive man and beast. Looking for weaknesses. Analyzing potential places of attack. Odin waited patiently, grinning at him from high atop his horse. Like he couldn't be more pleased that Squall was first thinking about what he wanted to do. Odin was measuring his skill level. He wanted to see how Squall was fighting. He liked what he saw so far. Now all Squall needed was the strength and skill to match it.
Shiva! Blizzard!
Squall threw out his hand. Odin raised his sword to fend off the magic that wasn't aimed in his direction at all. The spire of ice began erupting beside Sleipnir. Squall sprinted towards it, used the raising ice as a quick, improvised elevator. The eruption threw him in the air, over Odin's head. Squall brought his blade down, slamming it against the shoulder armor. The metal groaned angrily as the force dented it. Squall slammed his boots down and launched himself up and away. He landed on Sleipnir's head, then pushed back against Odin's helmet. He jerked the trigger down and an explosion of ice blasted around Odin's body. Squall ran down the length of Sleipnir's body and leapt across the distance to land on the seat of the Iron Throne. He turned, lifting his blade up again. Ice crystals and dust settled around his body. Shards of it cutting through his pale skin.
Ice Master! Cold as your heart and sharp as your soul. A fitting element for one such as you.
Odin shook his head, clearing away the ice with sparks of electricity. He rotated his shoulder, highlighting the new dent in his armor. Squall's eyes narrowed. Not because of how little apparent damage he had done, but because of the way that Odin had described him. Cold-hearted? Sharp soul? Neither of those things sounded particularly complimentary. Was that how Rinoa saw him?
What is it that you're thinking that makes you hesitate, warrior?
Squall's eyes focused back on him.
None of your business.
He lifted his gunblade and let off 3 quick shots. Enhanced with the power of Blizzara, each bullet that landed exploded in a shower of ice shards. 1 in the shoulder, 1 in the chest, 1 on the hip. Ice spears burst and erupted from the places they landed. Odin jerked back with each hit, reeling just slightly.
You react with anger to this question. Why?
Squall didn't answer him this time. He tapped his gunblade against his shoulder, unreasonably irritated with Odin at this moment. Not because of his lack of response to his attacks. Squall found that he decidedly did not like someone dissecting his every thought and movement. Squall raced down the Iron Throne, jumping off of the arm and running past Odin. He pivoted as Squall returned to the front of the room. He stared at him carefully, making Squall angrier. He would have preferred Odin just fight back.
Few things can trouble a warrior. A formidable foe. Personal weakness. A woman.
Squall's eye twitched.
I thought we were fighting.
He charged and Odin caught his sword again. Squall started getting faster, throwing a quick series of blows that Odin deflected and blocked like the expert swordsman he was. Odin kept his eyes on Squall's face as the flurry of blows came at him.
A woman, then. A meaningless distraction. You should never allow a woman to break your concentration, warrior. That is how you fail. She's not breaking my concentration.
Squall growled, striking out for Sleipnir. The horse reared back, its front four legs kicking at the air. Odin was forced to grab hold of the horse in order to prevent being thrown. He would deserve it for not riding a chocobo like a sensible person should.
Women have no place on the battlefield, either in body or mind. If you allow her to infect your thoughts, it will sap away your strength. You can be better than that.
Squall's eye twitched again.
What or who I think about is my own business. Your distracted heart makes you weak.
Odin threw him back easily. Squall flipped through the air, landing hard on his feet near the exit. Odin glared at him, as if insulted by his words.
I will kill you, warrior. Clear your heart and mind of her and focus on the battle.
Clear your heart of her. Can you feel me in your heart, Squall? Your distracted heart makes you weak. Our hearts will be together, even if our bodies aren't. Clear her from his heart? Just the thought of doing so felt strangely painful. His chest ached, dismayed at the possibility of being separated from her. He could feel her in his heart. She was deeply rooted there. Blooming like the brightest flower that he had ever seen. Filling him with light that he had thought lost to him. And tonight they were going to finally have their third date. He was going to take the chance, run the risk, and finally accept what his own heart had been telling him for a long time now. If the cost of that was a decrease in his strength, then that was a price he was willing to pay.
If that's your idea of strength,
Squall growled at Odin, flipping his punishment,
then I don't need it. So be it.
Odin lifted his own, black, curved blade. The wicked point shined in the light as Sleipnir pawed angrily at the ground.
Your death is certain, warrior. Shiva, Blizzara on punishment.
Ice glittered, building between the twin blades of punishment's body. The crystals built upwards, solidifying the blade and shining brightly in the dark room. Squall lifted the gunblade and let the light coming in through the door hit it. Let the energy of light absorb into the glassy ice. Odin kicked hard against Sleipnir's side, urging the horse forward. Like a bullet, the six-legged horse galloped forward. Its large, hoofed feet pounded hard against the ground. Steam rushed from its nostrils as Odin raised the blade.
Zantetsuken,
Odin growled, power drawing into his large sword. The energy glowed around the ice in Squall's gunblade, enhancing through multiple levels of refraction and reflection. Shiva used her eyes to build the power of the light, so Squall's punishment started glowing with a blinding light.
Blast zone,
he growled. Odin was on top of him. Squall lowered the blade and released the magic with a fire of his trigger. The explosion of ice and light blasted like a laser. Odin cried out as Sleipnir reared back from pain and surprise. The formless, pure energy strike hit like a hammer. Sleipnir fell back as Odin was thrown hard to the ground. His sword slipped from his fingers, skidding away. Squall's boot came down on the hilt, stopping it in place. Odin lifted himself up as the horse's legs flailed for a moment. The beast righted itself and Odin grinned.
Thou art strong, mortal,
he admired.
And I didn't forget her for a moment,
Squall said pointedly.
She must be a fine maid to be sure. A deal is a deal. I shall grant thee my powers. A fine swordsman such as you has the right to them.
Squall tilted his head curiously. Odin's grin and body faded at the same moment. The sword under Squall's boots became suddenly insubstantial. Odin didn't disappear into his head, he just disappeared. As Squall's foot hit the ground, he frowned as he felt a strange tingling in his fingers. He couldn't hear Odin any longer, and Odin did not take up a space in his head. Shiva insisted she remained alone. Which she also insisted was a good thing because she hadn't liked Odin. But Squall definitely felt a change in his body. Odin hadn't become a GF, but he had given Squall something. When he lifted his blade to slit it back into the sheath, he found it to be a great deal lighter. More like an extension of his own arm than a weapon. Odin had given Squall his swordsmanship abilities. Squall waited a moment for something else to happen. When nothing did, He turned from the Iron Throne and walked away calmly. He couldn't wait to get back to Rinoa. With no other options left to him, Squall returned to the platform. This time, however, he was pleased to find that it responded to him. He wrote it down and saw Zell waiting for him at the base of the twin steps. He had been seated but leapt up when he had heard the platform moving.
Squall!
He cried in relief.
You're okay. You are okay, right? Yeah,
Squall nodded, stepping down.
Let's get out of here. Man, any longer and I was going to run back to garden and ask for a search party. I felt like you were up there forever.
Squall said nothing as they started out of the ruins. Squall didn't want to bother waiting around. He felt like he was a man on a mission. He wanted to get back to garden soon. He felt like he had been away from Rinoa for weeks rather than a single day. The handrails were still glowing upwards as they made their way back down. The crumbling ruins of all that was left of Centro was quiet again. The ancient technology hummed along, the only living testament to what had been. Squall paused at the fountain and looked back up towards the top of the tower. What was this place used for? A dance club? A place of worship? Maybe just an ordinary office building? It was impossible. There was no one left who knew any more. And, pretty soon, even this last remnant of what had been would be gone. Squall turned away from it all. The past was the past. It didn't matter. What mattered was the future. What waited for him back at garden. And what he was going to do about it. At the base of the only staircase into the structure, Irvine was cursing colorfully as he reloaded his gun. He had taken up a crouching position on the last few steps and was busy killing tonberries. Well, attempting to.
The damn things won't stop coming!
He yelled, no longer enchanted by their cuteness. Squall stopped behind him and looked out at the area beyond the arch. He could no longer tell where the first tonberry they had seen was because his body had been joined by multiple others. Squall counted them up quickly and came up to near 20. He almost missed the legs of one sticking out from behind a far tree. There was another one waddling forward. He didn't at all seem disturbed by his fallen brothers. He was crawling over their bodies, his little lamp swinging as he kept going forward. It was taking almost 10 shots from Irvine's shotgun to take down one tonberry. And by the time one fell, another one had already appeared.
What ammo are you using?
Zell asked.
Demo. Squall, I'm getting nowhere here. I thought demo was strong ammo, but I can't even take out these waddling plush toys.
Squall crossed his arms.
Demo is good, but it's not the best. Say what?
Irvine looked over his shoulder, as though shocked.
Personally, I always use AP ammo,
Squall shrugged.
It's the best one for my gun and accepts magic really easily. And you were going to tell me this when?
Irvine yelled, irritated as he shot the tonberry again. The tiny thing crumpled over, dead at last.
I assumed you knew,
Squall shrugged.
Where do you buy it? You don't buy it. You refine it. I make my own ammunition. All higher-level ammunition users make their own bullets. It's easier to craft it to your own specifications that way. Okay, first of all, where do you even find time to make your own ammo?
Irvine shook his head in disbelief.
You have no time for anything. Secondly, no one ever told me this. Seems like a rather big gap in the Galbadia Garden curriculum,
Zell snickered.
I knew that, and I don't even use weapons. I just always thought you had a preference for store-bought. Or that you were lazy.
Squall nodded, agreeing with him. Irvine growled angrily.
Well, that's just great. And where am I supposed to learn this? You've got an instructor now, don't you?
Squall raised an eyebrow at him.
Just ask him. That's what his job is for.
Irvine sighed, collapsing over in disappointment.
Galbadia Garden always told us to leave weapon making to weapon makers. We weren't allowed to create our own ammo because that wasn't our job and we were told we would do it wrong. Yes, that's why you learn how to do it properly. The more self-sufficient you are, the better. What if you're away from ammo makers and run out? That's why I know how to sew,
Zell grinned.
So I can repair and make my own gloves. Don't use logic on me,
Irvine groaned.
Fine. Let's just get out of here before any more of those tiny monsters come. What? Do you not like em anymore?
Zell grinned as they started back towards the trees.
No way,
Irvine crossed his arms.
One of those damn things got close to me and stabbed me. And it still hurts. It's taking forever for my cura spells to fix it. Little bastards.
Zell was laughing at him when they felt the ground start shaking beneath them.
Whoa.
Zell fell forward as Irvine and Squall maintained their balance.
An earthquake.
Irvine turned to Squall. Squall frowned as another loud thud rocked the ground.
I doesn't feel like one.
The next thud was louder. As was the next. Squall realized it was footsteps about the same time that he saw something moving out in the trees.
It's a monster,
he warned, quickly drawing his gun blade. Though neither of them had seen it, Irvine and Zell both got ready. Their eyes scanned the area Squall was squinting at to see what he had. It didn't take very long after that.
Holy Hein!
Irvine muttered, his gun lowering slightly as his eyes widened. The tonberry that slowly crashed through the trees looked like he was just meandering their way. He was also many times the size of the other tonberries Irvine had been killing. He stood far over their heads, a golden crown glittering on his head. Zell laughed nervously.
Look, it's a king. Son of.
The loud thud of the monster's steps cut Irvine off. It stopped at the edge of the trees and looked over its subjects. Then it raised its face to them and its bright yellow eyes flashed in anger. In its massive hands, it carried a knife and lantern at the exact same size of the tiny tonberries. It looked ridiculous. And Squall actually felt threatened by the thing. It took over 10 shots to take down the little ones. How many would it take to kill this massive monster?
Irvine, go up the stairs and take your shots from above. Gone.
Irvine was only too glad to obey the command.
Zell, hand to hand. Wah! Why me?
He moaned unhappily.
Because you're stronger than I am,
Squall admitted shamelessly.
I'll back you up. Just do it.
Growling in anger and frustration, Zell ran forward. His fists were flaming, a result of the fierce spells he had stockpiled. His eyes burning almost as hot, Zell slammed his fists into the belly of the beast. The Tonberry reeled back, its burlap smoking, but it didn't appear worse for wear. Zell ducked under a stab from its knife, grabbed its arm, and twisted around to plow his elbow into the thing's back. Doing so opened a huge hole in the thing's defenses. Squall ran forward and sliced his gun blade up the monster's belly. A long path of ice shattered up its torso with a pull of the trigger. The Tonberry rocked back as Squall and Zell retreated a few steps. It only took a second for the durable Tonberry to regain its footing. Then Irvine's first rang out and a large hole opened in the burlap along its chest. The Tonberry jerked back from the demo shot. Its thick skin wasn't even penetrated yet.
You gotta be kidding me,
Zell groaned in disbelief.
Don't give it a chance to recover,
Squall ordered, running back in. The lantern swung his way and Squall ducked under it, just to let out a hiss of pain when the knife in the Tonberry King's other hand sliced through his right arm. The warmth of his blood spread down his arm as Squall twisted out of the way. Zell took his place, grabbing the Tonberry's arm before it could stab him again. Holding it, he kicked out and slammed his knee into the monster's gut. The fire engulfing his hands started burning the Tonberry's fingerless stump. Crying out, it jerked its hand back. Swinging around, it smacked its lantern against the back of Zell's head, sending him to the ground.
Ow!
Zell growled, pushing himself up.
Blizzara!
Squall threw out his magic. A large spire of ice slammed through the monster's shoulder, shattered a second later by Irvine's next shot. Angered, the Tonberry charged. And it was a great deal faster than any of its tiny subjects. Zell cried out when one of its large feet crushed him into the dirt. Squall leapt backwards, catching himself on one hand, then swinging back onto his feet. Irvine let out two quick shots, landing directly on its face, close to its eyes. The proximity to such a vulnerable area stopped its charge and it faltered, covering his head against any further shots. Opening its defenses again. Squall and Zell moved at the same time. Squall flipped his blade, giving up on cutting through the Tonberry's thick skin. The dull end was not a cutting edge, but it did more blunt trauma. He rushed towards the front of it. From behind, Zell had jumped back to his feet. Covered in dust and dirt, he ran towards the Tonberry and jumped at the last moment. He drove both feet into its back. The simultaneous hit crushed the Tonberry with their combined strength. Squall slid to a halt behind the Tonberry as Zell caught himself on his arms and flipped away from the Monster King. The Tonberry grunted, finally showing signs of being hurt. It was small, and the Tonberry recovered quickly, but it was proof that it could be hurt. That simple signal alone was enough to invigorate them into keeping up the offensive. The Tonberry turned in place, its face scrunching up in anger as it beheld them. Irvine took another shot. Though its head jerked forward from the force, it didn't seem to be bothered by it. It growled angrily at Squall and Zell, jumping up and down in its fury. The ground rocked under their feet from its massively dense weight. Irvine called out, slipping from his crouch on the stairs. He was pitched forward. His shotgun slipped from his hands and clattered down the steps. His hand shot out and caught one of the rusty rails. His body slammed against the rail, snapping it. He slid down a few more steps before he was able to catch himself again. This rung held under his weight. The new bruises on his body throbbed along his limbs and torso, causing him to grit his teeth. He pulled himself to his feet as the brothers let loose a cure spell into his body.
Hellfire!
Zell cried, summoning the fiery meteor up from the earth to crash down against the tonberry. The fiery explosion of molten stone gave Irvine enough time to race down to the bottom of the steps where his gun had landed. He hooked his toe around the barrel and kicked it up. His hand snapped around the end and his fingers found the familiar trigger as he took aim at the tonberry. From this distance, he didn't even have to try all that hard to hit it. The demo shot made black marks against its green skin, but didn't do much damage. The giant monster shook off the heat of the fire, glaring around at them angrily.
Diamond dust!
Squall yelled from across the clearing. The long tunnel of ice that appeared made Irvine's skin break out into gooseflesh. It was gone nearly as quickly as it had been summoned, shattering into a million pieces. The dichotomy of hot and cold hurt the tonberry more than anything. It was a shock to his system and his body rocked the earth again as he tried to shake it off.
Zell! Hit him!
Squall ordered.
Before he gets his balance back. Right.
Not thinking, Zell just following the order. The tonberry was leaning back, grabbing at its massive head. So Zell ran towards the front, intending to hit him there and knock him over. He jumped into the air and came down foot first against the monster's chest. Reeling, the enormous tonberry began falling backwards. Right onto Squall. Squall jumped to the side to escape. He wasn't fast enough. He felt the entire weight of the large tonberry slam against his back and pin him to the ground. He cried out in pain as he felt his ribs snap under the pressure. Squall! Irvine and Zell yelled at the same time, rushing forward.
Blizzard!
Irvine yelled, throwing out his low-level spell. The spire of ice that erupted from the earth hit the back of the tonberry's head. It threw him up like a piston and the monster fell to the side. Zell ran to Squall, who was grimacing, having some difficulty breathing. He could taste blood in the back of his throat.
Oh, shit!
Zell cried, panicked as Irvine stepped in front of them.
Cura!
The magic raced into Squall's body, augmented by the Cura spell he himself had already used. Both of them went to work on repairing the bone and tissue. Healing spells were slow though. It was already too late to prevent the blood that was quickly leaking into his lungs. Squall coughed once, flecks of that blood hitting his lips. He grimaced, grabbing for his chest as he tried and failed to push himself to his feet.
Shit, shit, shit!
Zell cried out.
Irvine! Come on, we gotta get back to Drive Katawaki. Working on it.
Irvine snapped, pausing to reload his gun. The tonberry, like an adamantoise flipped onto its back, was having difficulty righting itself. Irvine's gunshots peppered its skin, finally breaking through in some places. Dark green blood started oozing up as the armor-piercing rounds broke through.
Come on, brothers,
Irvine snapped, reaching into his own mind.
Let's do this!
Irvine's eyes burned purple for a small second as their power flooded into his veins. He reached deep into the earth. With them, he could feel every piece of sand. Feel the slow-moving, superheated lifeblood of the planet. Even the incredibly subtle, almost undetectable shifting of the solid earth beneath their feet. Irvine's hand closed on that earth as the tonberry finally managed to work its way up. Growling, Irvine brought forth the brothers from his mind. The strongest force of nature. The magic that could not be controlled by a single one. Calling forth the ancient and crushing power of the planet itself. A power that could only be summoned and controlled by multiples.
Brotherly love,
Irvine grinned, throwing his fist into the air. The tonberry rose with the large chunk of earth that the brothers threw into the air. So high that they almost lost sight of it. Irvine grinned and aimed at the block with his finger. He pulled the trigger that was his thumb as the brothers hit the slab of rock. The explosion of rock in the air hit the tonberry with all the force of a mountain. Then the monster fell the entire length. Its body crashed into the crater that Irvine and the brothers had created together. The force of his own, hyperdense body hitting the earth was even more painful and jarring. So much so that it caused the tiny golden crown on its head to fall from its head. Irvine frowned as the magical item bounced against the dirt. A large crack appeared in its center and, as a result, the golden sheen dimmed and turned to tin. The enormous tonberry king, having lost his magical item, started shrinking right before their gaze. The impossibly large body shrank down until the tonberry was exactly the same size of his brothers. Its large yellow eyes opened, blinking in surprise as it lifted its tiny body. It looked around, confused, until its gaze landed on Irvine. He growled at the tiny monster, lifting his shotgun and taking aim.
Wait!
The tiny monster held out its hands quickly. Sweating, he bowed.
Sorry.
Irvine frowned, lowering his gun slightly. He watched as the monster, no, the GF, burst into familiar pink and blue balls of energy. They raced towards him and merged into his chest. Irvine blinked in surprise as tonberry made his way up into his mind. He settled somewhere behind his eyes and Irvine felt him and the brothers examining each other.
What they?
He blinked, confused.
Irvine!
Zell yelled, reminding him that they had bigger problems. Turning on his heel, Irvine ran back over to his friends. Zell had pulled Squall's arm over his shoulders and the two of them had worked together to get him back onto his feet. Squall was having real difficulty breathing though and was grabbing for his hurting chest.
You take him,
Zell said even as Irvine was grabbing for his other side.
I'm going to keep the path clear of monsters. Let's get back quickly. Right,
Irvine nodded, grabbing Squall about the waist and wrist to keep him upright.
Don't you worry about a thing, man. We got you.
Squall didn't like being completely dependent on anyone at any time. Just at the moment though, he felt like he really didn't have a choice. As much as it stung his pride, he had to allow Irvine to walk him and Zell to protect him as they moved quickly back to garden. End of chapter.